Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 51, Hero or Villain, Part 1a. Yuzu had tackled Silent to the ground and was now staring up at Silent in between sniffles. The apron she was wearing over a yellow hoodie and pajamas was wrinkled and had come undone in her abrupt lunge. Even the pin that she had securing her bangs away from her eyes had fallen off and caused her brown hair to become disheveled. Yuzu could care less about her appearance. Her hands that were wrapped around Silent's waist felt like vices, unwilling to let go now that they'd made solid contact with a person Yuzu understood was not a figment of her imagination. In the time spent influenced by Ichigo, Karen, and his Hein's spiritual energy, the dormant spiritual awareness within Yuzu had already halfway awakened. She'd known about the presence of spirits and the supernatural ever since Ichigo had begun talking about seeing ghosts. To an extent, Yuzu knew that Ichigo wasn't lying ever since the recent visit to her mother's grave where something blurred and unseen had rendered her unconscious. She'd been told it was just a dream, that she'd just randomly fainted, but deep down, Yuzu had her suspicions. The spiritual world was dangerous, and she played along with Ichigo when he assured her that everything was fine. But then Ichigo disappeared. Yuzu didn't mean that Ichigo had disappeared in the literal sense, but something about Ichigo in the past few weeks felt off. He wasn't acting the same, and it felt as if someone else had taken over her brother's body, if only to act as a stand-in. Yuzu was concerned and sought Karen out to alleviate her worries, but different from before, Karen had begun brooding. Yuzu also paid careful attention to the fact that Karen hadn't called Ichigo brother in the past few weeks. The biggest change to the Kurosaka lifestyle was his Hein. Nowadays, he no longer sneak-attacked Ichigo and was often out on business trips he refused to elaborate on. What was strange was that Karen seemed involved in said business trips, and that the both of them refused to allow Yuzu to come. Now it had been 2 days and neither Karen nor his Hein had returned home. It struck Yuzu then that perhaps something beyond her understanding was going on. The blurred figures she'd see in her everyday life were becoming clearer and clearer. She'd even seen some person in a black shiakusho jumping from roof to roof. Yuzu had convinced herself that she was just imagining things. Spirits could exist, but she thought only Ichigo could really see them. However, it was in seeing Silent, the mother that should have been dead for years, that Yuzu stopped deluding herself. If being able to see spirits meant that Ichigo had been able to see their mother every day, then it just wasn't fair that he hadn't told her after all the years that had passed. Mommy. Yuzu's voice cracked, the sheer desperation in her tone unable to be described. In turn, Silent shuddered. The emotion welling up from deep within her, a feeling of protectiveness mixed with grief and regret, it was overwhelming. Silent had many words she wished to say and express, and even if she couldn't say them, even silence was an answer. Still, her mouth opened, her breath hitching as she tried to form words despite knowing the futility of the endeavor. All of her efforts were meant solely to assuage the trembling teenager before her. In Silent's mind, she was still seeing the image of a tiny girl, one of two born as twins, now older beyond anything Silent could have imagined. Yuzu, her daughter if she was remembering everything correctly. Silent winced, her left hand moving to press against her temple to soothe the growing migraine in her head. Her thoughts and memories were all in a jumble, with many parts and pieces unmistakably blurred. It hurt just to think too deeply about memories she felt too strongly for. The body remembered, but the mind could no longer link the experiences and emotions once felt to a certain degree. It felt awful. The fact that she knew Yuzu was her daughter, but couldn't reliably recall any of the memories she no doubt cherished. The thought terrified her as it would any mother. Silent would later admit that something inside her broke when Yuzu hugged her tighter in her silence, and she immediately tried to squirm free. In the end, Silent had underestimated her strength as a spirit and had inadvertently pushed Yuzu away. The devastation and the tears that threatened to spill from Yuzu's eyes made it clear to Silent that she'd made a mistake. Yuzu looked insecure, her knees were wobbling, and her lips quivered as her cheeks gradually began to puffen. Her right hand was gripping tightly onto the elbow of her left arm, and the experience of being shunned made it look as if Yuzu would bolt at any second. For the first time in a long time, Silent was beginning to curse not being able to speak. She tried to shout, to scream that she didn't mean to do what she did, but not a sound escaped her mouth. It was heart-wrenching. Yuzu ran, running straight for her room where the loud bang of a door slamming echoed in Silent's ears. The shattered plate that Yuzu had dropped upon seeing Silent was left forgotten. Subconsciously, Silent knelt and began cleaning the mess up, if only because her mind was in turmoil while listening to the muffled crying in Yuzu's room. What a mess. This was not how Silent wanted things to go. She sucked in a breath, doing her best to compose herself, yet failing miserably. She couldn't give up. Never. She realized now that it didn't matter if she remembered everything or not. Something stood out to her through the haze of her jumbled thoughts. No matter the time, place, or even her state of being, two words always existed ingrained in her soul. Protect them. She'd once died for the sake of that belief, and it was from those very words that she drew inner strength as a mother. Silent abruptly stood up, walking with purpose to Yuzu's room where the sound of crying was only growing louder and louder. If her words could not reach her daughter, then her actions could speak on her behalf. She didn't mean anything with her previous actions. It was more of an impulse that she'd failed to quell, as her mind related the image of teenage Yuzu to child Yuzu and became jarred with the differences. Standing in front of her daughter's door, Silent did not waste a second and stepped right on through. As a spirit, unless she wished to interact with the physical world, she could phase past solid objects. It became clear upon stepping into Yuzu's room, that Yuzu was aware of Silent's arrival. However, different from before, Yuzu further buried her face into her pillow rather than run to Silent. No child took rejection from a parent well, no matter how okay they said that they were. Yuzu was sprawled on her bed, lying flat on her stomach while her plush toys and pillows had been scattered across the floor. One plush toy in particular kept glancing between Yuzu and Silent and was being entirely ignored. "Gee, go away," Yuzu stammered, her voice hoarse. Silent approached, but Yuzu began to tremble. It was evident that she feared rejection a second time, as her mind would not be able to cope with it. Not from the one person she'd cherished in her childhood above all else. Silent pursed her lips at Yuzu's reaction, but steeled her resolve. A parent could not allow themselves to grow soft and weak when it came to their children. It was their duty to their children to guide them on the right path, but it also meant that if a parent made a mistake, they shouldn't shirk away from it. Heedless of Yuzu's words, Silent sat by Yuzu's bedside and began gently drawing circles on her back to coax her to at least look in her direction. Yuzu froze, the familiarity of Silent's actions like a zap of lightning that caused a lump to form in her throat. It was the same gesture Yuzu remembered Silent doing in the past whenever she or Karen were having a bad day. Seconds passed, time droning on into a full hour. Yuzu had not yet looked Silent in the eyes, but she'd been glancing up every couple of minutes as if to make sure Silent was really there. When caught in the act, she'd hurriedly avert her gaze, but the way she began clinging onto Silent again showed her real sentiments. Her hands had wrapped around Silent's waist, and her head found itself resting on Silent's lap even while snot and tears marred her face. In same ways, Yuzu was still the baby girl Silent recalled. She'd never been a person who could hold her anger for long, and her emotions were always apparent on her face. Any awkwardness that the two had felt at their first meeting was gradually fading away in the quiet lull. Words need not be spoken. Sentiments were enough. Lost in the familiar warmth of her childhood, Yuzu's eyelids began to droop, her head bobbing. Silent used that as the cue to gently run a hand through Yuzu's hair and hug her closer, ruining Yuzu's motivation to stay awake. 3 minutes later, and Yuzu slumped, asleep in Silent's arms. Silent kissed Yuzu on the forehead and carefully moved to lie Yuzu down on her bed. She tucked Yuzu in under her covers in the same way she'd done for Ichigo in his room. Watching Yuzu's sleeping form, Silent knew more than ever that she had to fix things with not only the situation as a whole, but her family as well. She was going to have to leave again. It pained Silent to think of what Yuzu may feel if she woke up and she wasn't around, but Silent knew that she wouldn't get anywhere doing nothing. Making sure that Yuzu was fast asleep, Silent got up, gave a cursory glance at a lion plushie feigning death on the floor, and then made her way out of the Kurosaki house. In Silent's hands was a pad of paper and a pen. Being unable to communicate was vital to get her point across, and she was fairly certain that she was shit at charades. Now then, she was sure it was around here somewhere. Silent was jumping over the rooftops while staring down at the streets for a peculiar candy shop with a vendor she could only describe as the very picture of a man children should stay away from. The bowl hat, scruffy beard, and eccentric attitude did nothing to help the man's case. Kisuk Urahara. In Silent's mind, it was the name of a friend she'd once been referred to by as Hein himself. If anything, her first impression of the man was shady. He had many secrets, and even more reasons for her to avoid interacting with him. He just struck her as the wrong type of careless, as if he'd shove a person down a pit with a hollow and draw amusement from watching the poor individual try to crawl out. Either get strong or die. It was the impression Kisuk gave her, which was why she'd never introduced her kids to him even if as Hein called Kisuk friend. Still, Kisuk was known for knowing how to solve a problem. Her mind was wandering, lost in the memories of the past. Silent would have missed the inconspicuously placed show in an alley in the middle of nowhere had she not picked up on a spiritual energy rapidly dashing towards her. Silent paused in the air, forming a platform of spiritual energy beneath her to stand on just as a black cat stopped 5 feet in front of her. Yuryuki? The name appeared at the forefront of Silent's thoughts. Masaki. Yuryuki sounded incredulous. She had come ready for a fight when she'd sensed a particularly high spiritual pressure tinged with the chaotic aura of a hollow, but this wasn't what she was expecting. How did you manage to escape? Yuryuki pressed. Silent shook her head. She wasn't in the mood to discuss such a meaningless question. She took out her pen and paper and quickly began writing. Kisuk, Silent wrote adamantly while beckoning towards the shop. Yuryuki's eyes widened. Why, you remember? The last time Yuryuki and Silent had met, it was clear for someone of Yuryuki's former profession as the captain of Squad 2, that Silent had treated her as a stranger. Aizen, the bastard, had probably done something with her memories, but now it seemed like whatever Aizen had done may have been temporary. Still, former friend or not, Yuryuki was within her right to be suspicious. Aizen was always the cunning one. Perhaps it was best to just detain Silent and allow Kisuk to run a diagnostic? Silent nodded to Yuryuki's question, but didn't miss the way Yuryuki still remained on edge. I need to talk. Silent quickly wrote. Much to Silent's surprise, Yuryuki relented. Unknown to Silent, but there was something in her gaze that caused Yuryuki to lose much of her caution. Aizen or not, there was no way to fake the genuine concern in Silent's eyes. Aizen was proficient in leading others astray, but Yuryuki was trusting her intuition in this instance. Follow me, Yuryuki beckoned, turning her back to Silent while raising her tail up. The shop's empty. Kisuk's been underground after recent developments. Rather than move towards the front of the shop on the road, Yuryuki led Silent towards the back where they both jumped down a hatch that led to an open wasteland training field. It was barren and filled with earthy brown rock formation with leafless trees. Kisuk was seen fiddling with some device while muttering some form of jargon that only he could understand. He was sitting with his legs crossed, and his back hunched. Tessai and Kisuk's other employees were nowhere to be seen. Upon noticing Yuryuki and Silent's arrival, Kisuk raised his brows at Silent before dipping his head and pressing his hat further down to shadow his eyes. Well, isn't this an unexpected surprise? Silent didn't beat around the bush and immediately moved towards Kisuk. I need your help, she wrote. Oh, Kisuk let out a small easygoing grin. As much as I'd love to help in the troubles of a longtime friend, I'll have to ask that you explain yourself first. You see, I may act all laid back and all, but this situation leaves me no chance to do even that. Kisuk's tone became flat, a sharp edge appearing in his features as one hand held his wooden cane close. If this is another elaborate ruse by Aizen, then I'd much rather not take the chance. Not with the kind of help Aizen seems to have obtained. If it came down to a fight, Silent knew that she was outnumbered, but in the face of Kisuk's unconcealed threat and Yuryuki's inaction to chastise Kisuk for said threat, Silent wrote one sentence. Shiro isn't bad. He was the one who saved me. And suddenly, both Kisuk and Yuryuki blinked in confusion. This was the moment Silent used to elaborate her point now that she'd gotten their attention. I see, Kisuk hummed lightly to himself, a hand placed beneath his chin after Silent's summary of events. Yuryuki's thoughts in comparison were difficult to gauge in her cat form, but she seemed stunned regardless. Silent waited for a response from Kisuk, hoping that he could somehow discover a method to salvage everything. At the very least, she'd stressed that Shiro was not an enemy even if he was a hollow. She'd even spoken about how human Haribal and the others were. Both Kisuk and Yoryuki took a moment to process this fact as they were more open towards hollows, but to believe that a majority of them hailing from Shiro's lands could be trusted? That was more difficult. Putting aside your views on hollows, the fact that you've said that Shiro is working with Aizen is disconcerting, Kisuk said after a moment. Kind and compassionate as you portray him to be, Yoryuki tells me that he didn't seem to be the sort that was taking orders from Aizen. Shiro's strong, Silent wrote as an explanation. Maybe stronger than Aizen. Kisuk, though disbelieving of Silent's claim, humored her. All the more reason he has to be defeated. And here, Silent disagreed. She tried to make her displeasure known, but she stiffened. Silent suddenly felt uncomfortable. There was a look of pity in Kisuk's eyes that was being directed towards her. The concept of good or evil, hero or villain, no longer matters at present. The distinction is obscured in the face of impending catastrophe and death. A choice has to be made. Yoryuki sighed in the background, clicking her tongue in distaste, but doing nothing as she knew their options to save the world's balance was dwindling by the day. Silent did not like where this was going. She made to stop Kisuk from suggesting what she thought he was going to suggest, but failed to do so in time. This Shiro seems to trust you, Kisuk looked Silent right in the eyes. For the benefit of all, will you not lend us your help and subdue him before he causes the end of the world as we know it? No. Silent immediately refused, but Kisuk was prepared and quickly countered. Do you have any idea what Aizen actually intends to do, and what will happen to your family because of it? Silent felt an ominous premonition. She wasn't going to like what she was going to hear, and she looked utterly appalled at the small prayer bead Kisuk placed in her hands after his explanation of Aizen's goal. Thereafter, Kisuk said 7 words. 7 words, and it looked as if he'd aged several years all at once. Good or evil, do the right thing. By the time Silent left in a flurry of spiritual energy, Kisuk felt Yoryuki shift into her human form and sit down behind him. Their backs were pressed together, and the two longtime friends did not have to speak to understand what the other was currently thinking. Kisuk was tired of the world's bullshit, and the fact that he'd been the cause of the sheer turmoil in Silent's eyes. Hey, Yoryuki, Kisuk called softer than he'd ever spoken before. I'm a bastard, aren't I? Yoryuki's only response was to lace her fingers over Kisuk's own and squeeze to show her support. Through thick or thin, back to back, just like old times. Even if everyone hates you, I'll always believe in you. Chapter 52, Hero or Villain, Part 1b. Brands knew that today wasn't going to be a good day. Already, he'd felt ashamed that he'd failed to participate in a fight with his lord in the fake Karakura town, and now he was acting as escort to someone he'd rather not be associating with. Brands grumbled while trudging his feet through Hyuko Mundo's sand. He was a humanoid raven-type hollow standing at over 3 meters tall. Feathers covered his body over his thighs and forearms, while scales matted his shins and upper arms. His feet were claws, and his hands covered by layers of thick bone plate armor. He had great white feathered wings that sprouted from his shoulder blades spanning a length of 6 meters. Ordinarily, he preferred hovering from place to place as it felt constraining to fold his wings, but today was a bitter exception. Shoulders slumped, Brands felt like slamming his bird-masked face over a rock if only to take his mind off the fact that he was acting as Baragan's escort into the lands of the Vasto of White. Never in his life had he ever pictured himself doing such a thing, especially when Baragan had the audacity to constantly challenge his lord in battle. However, Brands knew that he had a debt of gratitude to repay, and Baragan's request was well within Brands' tolerance range. It neither jeopardized Shiro's rule, nor did it seek to destabilize relations within the territory. If anything, Brands was surprised that Baragan would ask of him something that seemed so trivial. Brands glanced at Baragan to see not the skeletal frame donned in eerie purple robes that he was used to, but the figure of a battle-hardened old man instead. Then again, Brands still felt jarred that every hollow he was used to seeing on a daily basis now resembled humans with broken masks. Aaron Carr, his friends had said the transformation was called. And suddenly, Brands was feeling left out. Due to recuperating from his injuries, he'd chosen not to bother his colleagues and flew off to find an isolated location to recover. This meant that he'd missed the day everyone had become Arrancar. If he wanted to gain more power like everyone else, he'd have to ask Aizen, which was no small feat for Brands. He was still distrusting of Shinigami in general, and Aizen was no doubt a Shinigami. "Who did you say you were looking for again?" Brands asked Baragan to clarify. Baragan did not look amused. The wrinkles over his aged appearance only became more prominent as his patience began to run thin. "Coyote Gingerbug," he said coldly. An air of purple spiritual energy surrounded Baragan like a lit torch. Knowing the lethal nature of Baragan's power, Brands quickened his pace and warned other Arrancar to make way lest Baragan lose his temper like he was known to in the past. "I don't know a coyote," Brands admitted, much to Baragan's silent displeasure. "But surely Lady Haribel and the others will know." Brands felt Baragan's aura recede if only slightly after hearing the alternative, but that was enough for Brands. One touch of the energy Baragan was exuding, and death was certain. Brands could not understand how his lord was able to get along with Baragan. In fact, Brands could see that Baragan would have preferred Shiro's presence rather than his own. The old man treated everyone else other than Shiro and close subordinates as dispensable. Well, recently Baragan's attitude had mellowed after he stopped calling himself a god king, but old habits died hard. Baragan was not sociable by any means of the word. Brands could see some sort of festivity in the distance, but all activity seemed to die the moment Baragan's presence was sensed approaching. The closer Brands led Baragan forward, the tenser the air became until the prominent people of the territory cautiously stepped forward. "Baragan," Haribel said warily. "What do you want?" Haribel's eyes were narrowed, her arms crossed beneath her chest as she exuded her spiritual pressure to circumvent Baragan's influence over the area. She wasn't the only one, as Nell, Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose joined her and alleviated the pressure some of the weaker individuals felt. Strong as they were, Baragan was an existence to be feared through presence alone. However, 3 individuals seemed to care less about Baragan's arrival. One continued to idly poke at a sword erected over the ground in curiosity, the other lay on his back, and the third was pointing a finger. Grimjo, Noidara, and many other hollows waiting eagerly for a fight in the distance were bound to be disappointed. Starkey raised a brow from the ground, but yawned and turned the other way while Lilynet paused in her bickering with a random hollow that she was just as strong as Starkey. Meanwhile, the one that had immediately garnered Baragan's full attention finally realized that she was being stared at, and looked on back. "My business is not with any of you," Baragan said dismissively, ignoring the sharp narrowing of Haribel's brows, and the outrage on Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun's faces. "You," Baragan pointed to Coyote. "Let us talk." Brands, who was quietly observing the situation, felt like he was missing something. Forceful and demanding as Baragan sounded, was that respect he heard in Baragan's tone? Brands felt that his past injuries may have hampered his mind, but Haribel and the others also seemed to detect the difference in Baragan's tone and furrowed their brows. "And what do you want with her?" Haribel asked. Gone was her confrontational attitude, replaced instead by a layer of carefully concealed curiosity. Everyone else was no different. At first, Brands noted that Baragan looked annoyed at being pressed for answers, but Baragan really had changed in some ways. His temper became more controlled. "The second release," Baragan answered, causing everyone's ears to perk up. This was a topic that everyone wished to know, and had only refrained from asking Coyote out of respect for Shiro. In which case, why couldn't Baragan discuss the topic with Coyote for everyone to hear and save time? And then everyone realized that it was still Baragan they were dealing with. Improved temperament or not, his arrogance to not associate with perceived weaklings had been earned through his own power. "Now hold on," Nell spoke up in the growing murmur of the crowd. Putting aside her desire to obtain information about a second release, there was something more important that had to be addressed. "What gives you the right to order anyone in these lands? Shiro would not allow such a thing, and last I recall, you haven't exactly defeated him yet. Therefore, his words are law." Brands expected Baragan to erupt in rage due to his rivalry with Shiro, but this wasn't the case any longer. Whatever revelation Brands had missed in the battle of the fake Karakura town, must have been major because Baragan did not take actions at Nell's words at all. Rather, Baragan countered through a different angle. "And who are you to say what Shiro would allow or not?" Baragan's expression was stern, a look of reminiscence flitting over his eyes. He raised a hand up into the air and clenched his hand into a tight fist. What you all believe to know about the Vasto of White pales in comparison to what he truly is and what he has done. Grudgingly, he is the true God King of this world. I will never forget what I saw that day. Baragan revealed a side of himself that no one thought him capable of. All Hollows revered strength above all else, and Baragan was no different. You speak as if you know him better than any of us, Nell countered, feeling distinctly uncomfortable with the notion. After all, in her mind, she'd spent more time around Shiro than Baragan ever had. Haribal, Apasai, Sung Sun, and many other Hollows who had known Shiro since the start were of the same opinion, but Baragan remained unperturbed. However, he was both done and fed up with the notion of putting up with doubts any longer. That's because I do. Baragan lowered his tone, cutting off any form of rebuttal. She does as well. Baragan pointed at Coyote. Everyone turned to stare at Coyote, but she didn't deny the statement at all, and instead looked like she'd been flattered. In fact, a flicker of superiority manifested on her expression, if only because Coyote had never experienced the feeling before. And suddenly, Nell and Haribal's expressions darkened. Baragan left, and Coyote decided to follow. Brands was left to deal with an irate crowd. Wind began to blow upon a desolate world of white, grains of shifting sand roughly grating against one's skin. Bereft of life as it appeared, to Shiro it was still home in a sense. This was his world, stagnant yes, but not forever. All he need do was will it back to full gear. By this point, Shiro could do so at any time, but at the cost of what Hueco Mundo stood for all Hollows. A haven. Shiro frowned and put the matter aside for the time being to dwell on something more important. He'd made his way out of Aizen's residence and was wandering the desert of his own soul in search of a place that he could think without influence. He trudged along, his feet leaving not a trace on the sand to prevent others from following him as he lost himself in his thoughts. Aizen's grin had revealed not a web of hidden lies and ulterior motives, but a clean slate, an olive branch. The man was being entirely truthful, perhaps for the first time in his life. Shiro even suspected that Aizen didn't consider Jin or Taisen as real comrades or anything more than acting partners. In turn, the loneliness that he'd felt from Aizen must have been genuine. He who stands at the top, stands alone. It was a familiar feeling, as Shiro himself had ended up abandoned on his path as a hero in life. In some way, it could be argued that Aizen was trying to manipulate him out of malicious intentions, but this simply wasn't the case. Shiro could feel through the link he shared with Kyuka Suijutsu that Aizen actually considered him to be the first equal he could acknowledge as a comrade. In short, he was someone with the ability to understand Aizen for who he was, and Aizen found value in the sentiment. Shiro felt disinclined to break the trust he'd started with Aizen. Kyuka would probably hold a grudge against him for an eternity if he did so, but now came the real choice. Was he doing the right thing? Had he made the wrong choice? Aizen sought to destroy the world order, threatening to wipe out the peace of all Hollow, a world order Aizen had explained was built upon the suffering of an individual forced into a role not of his own choosing. The Soul King was someone to be saved. Did Shiro need any other reason? In the first place, maybe this was the purpose of his arrival into the current world. To save it from itself and return everything back to zero. Caught up in his musings, Shiro had inadvertently walked towards a location he felt the most in tune with himself, a familiar barren hill littered with swords of his own making. Considering this was his inner world, this hill was probably the representation of the struggles he'd overcome in life. However, Shiro wasn't alone like he'd expected. Someone was already standing at the foot of the hill. Nell? There was no doubt that it was Nell standing before Shiro, and she looked uncharacteristically unsettled. She was biting on the nail of her thumb, and she was pacing back and forth while wearing the white Arrancar uniforms modeled after the Shinigami's Shiakusho. Pesha and Dondokaka were nowhere nearby, which meant that she must have sent them away to maintain her image. The look on Nell's face when she realized that Shiro was staring at her could only be described as an utterly blank slate. She'd dismissed her followers for the express reason that she clearly didn't want to be seen, and Shiro of all people was the one to see her. "Shiro," she said with a stiff nod. Shiro didn't know whether he should congratulate her for keeping her voice from breaking, or keep silent. In any case, the red creeping up Nell's forcibly composed features was symbol enough of her embarrassment. "It looks like I was the first to stumble in on you," Nell muttered more to herself than him, directly changing the subject. "Luck has beaten the shark and wolf's senses." "Luck?" Shiro called his E. Shiro chose to pretend not to have heard what Nell said in order to save himself from thinking about future troubles. He could guess as to who else would wish to be seeing him right now, but at the moment, he wanted to be alone. Silence stretched as a result. Shiro observed Nell, and she seemed like she wanted to ask something but was having trouble bringing it up. She kept glancing in his direction, pursing her lips, and then discreetly turning her gaze away. The process repeated twice before Shiro could no longer contain himself. He'd always been someone who put the problems of others above his own. He put aside his thoughts of the future and placed his full attention on the person in front of him. "Is there something on your mind?" he asked. It was in taking this action that Nell inevitably came to a decision. "No. No, I don't." Nell shook her head as a wry smile graced her lips. "Honestly, you're a real piece of work, aren't you?" Shiro did not know how to react. Was Nell complimenting him or insulting him? He didn't want to know. Women were mysteries even as hollows, or perhaps he was the one with something wrong in his mind. "Sorry." He tried. While Nell grinned, Shiro scratched at the back of his head in confusion, not knowing that he'd just reaffirmed the very reason Nell chose to follow Shiro from the beginning. He looked at her not with any caution or malicious intent, but with an earnest approach. He saw hollows not as the monsters they were portrayed to be, but as fellow individuals. Moreover, Nell wasn't stupid. Shiro liked to believe he'd been subtle, but never underestimate the intuition of a woman. Nell had determined that Shiro had things he wished to contemplate on his own, but for her who appeared troubled, he put those matters aside. Honesty, this kind of man isn't suited to be a hollow. Yet on some levels, Nell couldn't help but be thankful that Hueco Mundo had someone like Shiro. Another Baragan would have been hell, and hell was a place no soul wished to visit or risk getting bound by unseen chains. Suddenly, Nell drew her sword strapped to her waist. The reflection of light on the blade's surface striking in its splendor. "What is a blade meant to cut and protect?" she asked offhandedly. Nell's answer was simple. A blade was meant to cut worthy adversaries, not simple monsters that only serve to dull the edge. It was meant to protect the values of its user, that which made them noble and above beasts. Shiro replied with an answer that astounded even Nell. "Nothing," Shiro said in monotone. "Steel that feels nothing, and protects nothing. There is nothing that needs to be cut, nor is there a reason for a sword to be wielded for the express purpose of protection. An unfeeling blade." Unknown to Nell, there was one other individual listening into Shiro's answer with keen hearing from far off in the distance. Resting with his back leaning by a rock, Ulquiorra felt as if he'd found someone he could actually relate with. A nihilistic sword of no meaning. Nell curled her lips down into a frown. "Then what purpose do you have in wielding your swords when there's nothing worth cutting or protecting?" Direction, Shiro didn't hesitate to answer. This was the way of his life. Tainted, marred, bent, or malformed through time, so long as direction existed there was meaning to be had in carrying an unfeeling sword. A blade does not decide between good or evil, that is the sin or choice of the wielder. I choose the path, and the sword carves the road ahead for a better tomorrow no matter the cost. No matter the cost? No matter the cost? The words were chilling based on the implied intentions of self-sacrifice. Nell did not know how to respond, as she didn't know how to feel, but Ulquiorra was different. He suddenly realized a word that could describe Shiro as he was now. Empty. Neither possessing excess good or evil, but holding on to a single ideal that served to stabilize the meaning of his existence. A sword in mind and body. Ulquiorra could respect that, because in some ways, he was the same. Ulquiorra closed his eyes and chose to no longer listen. Nell looked shocked, before shock switched to determination when she realized just why Shiro was fighting for a better future despite revealing that his reason for wielding his swords was so shallow. For the same reason she chose to protect Pesha and Dondakaka, he was fighting to keep her and everyone safe. She was part of his precious people. Suddenly, Nell realized that Baragan had been right. She really didn't know as much about Shiro as she had assumed. It would be too late to regret if Shiro somehow ended up dying for her and everyone else's sake. Without warning, Nell hugged her arms around Shiro, squeezing him for all that she was worth. "If you ever try to do anything stupid, I'll kick your ass." "No, I'll get everyone to help kick your ass. It's a promise." Shiro opened and closed his mouth at the sudden threat, but had no time to press for an answer as Nell glared at him before sighing and leaving. "I know you wanted to be alone, so I'll leave you to it, but don't you dare forget my words." With her piece said, Nell took off with a conflicted expression, a trail of sand and spiritual energy left in her wake. Left behind, Shiro found himself alone as he intended staring upon a barren hill of swords. The path that he'd walked, the methods and sacrifices he'd taken to reach such a point, in the end, they were what defined who he was even in death. In talking with Nell, perhaps he'd already come to a decision when she'd asked the purpose of why he wielded his swords. It wasn't wrong to save another. If the Soul King was truly a prisoner of his own palace, then there was no need for him to hesitate. He'd save the Soul King and make sure to keep causalities to a minimum. Now the problem was how to go about doing so. Should he follow Aizen's plans word for word and hope nothing went wrong, or should he attempt to come up with his own methods? Maybe he could even collaborate with Aizen? Shiro mused on the topic for over 2 hours. It was in finding his resolution that Shiro became aware of a presence punching through Hueco Mundo's barriers and manifesting behind him. Shiro abruptly turned around to see a tall man with a long face, broad chin, and high cheekbones staring down at him with reddish-brown eyes. The man wore a double-breasted white trench coat with the symbol of a star in the middle. The man had long hair and a mustache that swayed in the wind. The man's mutton-chop beard creased as the man's lips thinned while looking at Shiro. What surprised Shiro was that the man had boldly entered Hueco Mundo on his own. A Quincy? It was the only deduction in Shiro's mind as he felt the vast spiritual energy the man was outputting. Faster than one could blink an eye, the man raised a hand and began to gather the ambient energy in the air. Shiro's eyes narrowed while feeling the build-up of spiritual energy around the man skyrocket into the moonlit horizon. Sand began to rise and shift into a storm while the ground began to shake and crumble. There was no way that Aizen, Haribel, and the other hollows could not sense the massive influx of pressure. Either the man was arrogant to the point that he thought nothing of Hueco Mundo's forces, or Shiro was being belittled. In the man's hand, embers of spiritual particles were rapidly converging together in the shape of a sword. The nearby boulders and quartz trees of Hueco Mundo were quickly breaking down into nothing more than flecks of blue light. Contrary to Shiro's expectation, the man did not yet strike despite the ample opportunity the man had to perform a sneak attack. Instead, the smirk that made its way onto the man's face caused Shiro to come to a realization. A test? He was being tested on whether he could defend his own world. There was a difference between being a fool and an idiot. A fool was an individual who understood the dangers of his or her actions yet still chose to act on them, but an idiot was someone who acts while ignorant. Shiro knew he was a fool at the worst of times, but this was just plain belligerence. Shiro's eye narrowed, his own hands mirroring the man's own as he opened the channels of his magic circuits in full and began his retaliation. "You've made a mistake." Wind began to buffet the area around him, the spiritual particles in the air abruptly freezing in place. Power flooded through Shiro's veins, beginning the process of attraction and forming circuit-like patterns over his skin. The veins of his very body were filling with energy in a manner that looked far too much like the Quincy's blood. Trace. On. You wish to form a construct of spiritual energy? Shiro's hands seemed to grasp at something unseen, beckoning the world to his will in a battle of mind over matter. The spiritual particles in the air no longer remained stationary. Like water flowing down a funnel, the particles traversed to Shiro's side at a far greater rate than the man could hope to match. Then I will take it from your hands. What was originally the energy of his world, his own energy, would not so easily obey the whims of another. Shiro may not have been a Quincy by birth, but in terms of structural analysis and manifesting constructs, he was leagues ahead of the average Quincy. A battle between Shinigami was a battle between spiritual energy, but a battle between Quincy was a battle of spiritual control, they who lord over the energy of the world as descendants of a king. The man's expression hardened while watching the spiritual energy that he'd already gathered into a sword leave him at a visible rate impossible to circumvent. Among all Quincy, he who holds absolute control over the world and its spiritual energy was known only by a single title: an Almighty. Chapter 53, Hero or Villain, Part 2. What was lost and what was gained. In the greater world where power reigned supreme and the entire foundation of reality was based upon the forced imprisonment of a single individual, was it all truly just if it was for the greater good? Wywak, king of the Quincy, would disagree. At the beginning of all, there were no such concept as good or bad, making the notion of a greater good nothing more than an excuse to hold aloft a system of values that benefited a single side at the expense of another. For the sake of true balance, the system must fall, and so war would come, and it did. The First Blood War ended with the Quincy's defeat and eventual retreat. They were hunted like wolves, killed in the hundreds for the sole crime of killing Hollows. It was then that the great king of the Quincy learned fully of injustice. He who was born with nothing and relied solely on the sharing of his power to consolidate the meaning of his existence, now knew of personal experience, cut down at the hands of Yamamoto Genri Yusai. Yet it wasn't to be. Even in defeat the Quincy sang from deep within the war song of 1,000 years, and a slumbering king. The first war was lost. No, perhaps it had never ended, but had only just begun. Soon the world would return to its origin. No soul society, no Hueco Mundo, and no distinction between the living and the dead. The day of return drew ever nearer. If Hueco Mundo did not fall first, then so be it. The soul society would fall first in its stead. Sands blew over the dunes, small grains that roughly rubbed against the skin and worked their way beneath clothes. To even have the time to make such idle observation showed just how relaxed Shiro was acting. He was never one to belittle opponents since he himself had often been in the losing end of many confrontations in his life, but this situation was different. If there was one place that he could have confidence in his own strength, weak as he'd been in the past, it was his inner world. This was the reflection of his soul, his reality made real. The dunes and lifeless landscape revealed the ever-shifting mentality of his thoughts and being. To create a world the Hollows could live in, he'd changed even the very nature of who he'd been by casting aside everything and forgetting. The forge that had lost its purpose would lose its flame and therefore give rise to a dimension suitable for the emptiness all Hollows faced. For Shinigami it was the same in their inner realms. When sad it would rain, when angry a hurricane would blow. The Zanpakuto knew it all, and as such did their best for their wielders. Did Shiro have a Zanpakuto? He didn't know, but if it was based off a part of Shinigami's soul, then what sort of Zanpakuto did he have after becoming an Arrancar? It was a question for another time. The point was, he was showing his current adversary the futility in his manner of combat. What will you do now? He asked of the adversary across from him. Silence was the only answer. Shiro watched as one by one, fragments of the spiritual energy in the air attempted to form once again in the man's hands, but to no effect. They dispersed at a thought. It was a foolhardy notion to shape and will the spiritual energy in Hueco Mundo when in front of him. He was the world, and the world was him. This was his soul and strength of being. The ambient energies within it were undoubtedly his own. As such, to wrestle control of said energy while he was consciously aware of it was not possible. The man tried and tried again, seemingly uncaring about the constant repetition of failure. Interesting, the man finally said, his hands falling to his sides as a grin formed over his face. Your control over spiritual energy dwarfs even my own. From the sand, to the sky, to the very air in this place, they are all tied down to your existence such that it would be no lie to say that you are the sovereign of this world. Remarkable as that is, I will soon be the same, and we'll see then who the true Almighty is, but for the time being, I'll have to admit that operations in Hueco Mundo will have to be put on hold. It would seem there was a reason why Quilge and Giselle failed to return. You sound as if you can just up and leave. Shiro's voice hardened, power welling up from deep within him. You'd be mistaken. If you truly believe what you just said, then what makes you think you can escape from me? All at once, swords began to form a wall enshrouding the area. They filled up the ground and the air in a circular dome, appearing all at once and giving no chance for reaction. As expected, the man hardly flinched while observing the surroundings. There was no delay nor instant to gather spiritual energy. One moment there's nothing, and in the next, the swords appeared as if they'd always been there. I reckon that common principles such as distance, force, or gravity, do not matter in this space. Whether or not I'm here or somewhere else in this world, a sword would always be able to fire from my back or any blind spot. A terrifying principle, but as expected of people of our station. Tell me, here, the man grew serious, solemnness in his gaze. Were you too, born out of nothing, an empty shell having neither emotion or feeling? Shiro failed to see the relevance in the question, but he could relate. Shiro Emiya, the boy who had died in a hellish otherworldly blaze, had once had nothing left of him to show. The husk that was left was a being that had no emotion or feelings, but grew to learn of yearning and desire upon seeing the happiness in a single man's smile. He learned of human qualities, right and wrong, as he grew up with a dream to be an ally of justice, but what did this all matter? Your silence is telling, the man said. So, what? Shiro could not see any point to the conversation. Perhaps there never was, except for the man's own curiosity. I'll give you two choices, surrender and explain your plans for attacking Hueco Mundo, or die here. Shiro never liked killing, and ever since he'd gotten his memories and experience of the living back, this fact never changed. However, he knew the difference of when to kill and when not to kill. If a person was harmless even if let go, then there was no need to take a life. Yet in this case, the man had clearly shown his intentions to cause harm, and the man was strong enough to do so. Letting the man go free would be a naive mistake he'd make in his youth, but not now when he had others he wished to protect. Regardless, mercy was still an option he always gave. Choose. You only get one chance. His tone was clipped, the swords hovering in a dome beginning to vibrate with spiritual energy. The man merely scoffed and once again tried to forcibly gather spiritual energy despite knowing the futility of it. Wind blew around him in a storm as the man genuinely put his all into taking sovereignty of Hueco Mundo's spiritual energy. The man had made his choice. Shiro closed his eyes, took a breath, and then opened his eyes again. So, be it. Without another word, the swords descended. Try as he might, the man didn't even attempt to dodge, much to Shiro's surprise. He could feel the man's sheer spiritual energy. The man should have been able to put up something of a resistance, but the man hardly lifted a finger aside from studying Hueco Mundo's spiritual energy for as long as possible. If you were expecting a grand battle, then you're bound to be disappointed. The man spoke despite his body looking like a pincushion after the dust settled. Blood marred the sand, leaking from the man's body in a slow trickle, and yet, the man grinned in content while dying. His legs gave out on him, and the man collapsed onto the ground, sprawled while staring up at the moon above. Have you seen enough, my king? The words caused Shiro to balk. He could tell that they weren't being directed at him at all, but towards another source that he could vaguely infer was watching. It came first from the movement of spiritual energy in the air, mixing seamlessly with his own that he hadn't been able to detect the oddity until he focused. It was his own fault. Hueco Mundo was filled with hollows with varying spiritual energies. Unless he memorized them all, he couldn't just assume that a spiritual energy he was unfamiliar with was of ill nature. Lloyd. Your service will be remembered. Shiro heard a whisper in the air. The source of the words wasn't from a voice, but was spoken in a particular manner in which the foreign spiritual energy buzzed to make sound. It is an honor. Walking closer, Shiro frowned as he watched his opponent's body change rapidly. Gone was the long black hair, full beard, and mustache. The wrinkles over the man's forehead and high ridge bones seemed to melt from his face to reveal what was beneath. It was a man whose features consisted of a third eye, a bald head, and headphone-like coverings over his ears surrounded by dark-colored trim. The man was clearly dead, but despite it all, he was smiling from the words he'd heard in the air. Shiro saw it for what it was, loyalty. He'd seen it himself in the eyes of those who followed him in Hueco Mundo. The only difference was that he would never use said trust to kill a friend. Who are you? His tone was curt, his arms dropping by his side as he dismissed his projected swords. Judging by how you are not in front of me and the nature of the spiritual energy in the air, you're likely viewing this space by coding it in your spiritual energy and creating a scene from there. If you knew it would be a danger in coming here, Why send your people and not come yourself? The time has not yet come. Why did matter? Shiro felt a growing distaste for the apathy he could sense from the spiritual energy in the air. And so, because the time hadn't come, you'd jeopardize your own comrades. Subordinates, sons, daughters. The air vibrated in correction. Regardless, the lingering spiritual energy soon began to dissipate. We shall meet on the day of rebirth. And then it was gone, like the energy had never been there. By the time Aizen, Jin, and the other nearby Arrancar and Hueco Mundo arrived on the scene, all that was left was Shiro, a corpse, and a lot of questions in the air. Haribel was one of the first Vasto Lord-class Arrancar to arrive on scene, and when she did, it was once again to feel like she'd missed being of use to Shiro, who dealt with the situation himself. Always late. Was she even of any use? Not once had she felt as if she'd ever accomplished enough to repay everything that he'd done for her, Mila Rose, Apasai, and Sung Sun. What sacrifice was left for her to make in order for him to acknowledge her and her efforts? It was a strange sort of desire born from deep within her. At first, she'd thought it was just admiration for the strength Shiro wielded, but then why did she feel so conflicted that she hadn't been of use again? Her brows furrowed as she grimaced, her arms crossing, her mood plummeting. If she had arrived sooner, at the very least, she may have been able to lighten his burden. This was a failure of obligation. Shiro had made the sacrifice in the very beginning to shield them from Baragan's forced recruitment, and she was failing to repay that life-changing debt. Then there was the way he'd offered a means for Sung Sun, Apasai, and the rest to enter the realm of a Vasto Lord by sharing his own power through the production of spiritual swords. He'd changed Hueco Mundo's very nature of life and death for a hollow. Never again would a hollow have to fight with the many voices in their heads vying for control in their path of evolution. The sacrifice of another was no longer needed to bolster the strength of one's growth. In turn, what sacrifice had Shiro made to do so? This thought ate away at her mind ever since Baragan had come and requested a talk with Coyote. Before he'd left, he'd hinted her ignorance of Shiro, and if she was reading between the lines correctly, the type of sacrifice he'd made. Haribel balled her hands into fists, and kept her expression carefully neutral as the others began to arrive one by one. Grimjo and the other Arrancar only came due to the prospect of a fight, but grew disappointed when there was no battle to be had. They, like many of the Arrancar in Baragan's territory, promptly left with little concern. Aizen and his Shinigami merely nodded at Shiro before departing. Of those that stayed longer, Brands made more of a show with his arrival. "Forgive my negligence, my lord." Brands got onto his knees and smashed his head into the ground with a thud. "I've failed to accompany you in battle, and now an intruder had managed to reach you even in Hueco Mundo. I have no excuses." Haribel's features darkened. She may not be as vocal as Brands or the other Arrancar, but she still had her own thoughts and opinions. The words spoken by Brands berating himself not only served to express his sentiments, but unknowingly those that felt the same in the crowd. Ergo, her own sentiments on the matter. Listening to it was like rubbing salt on a wound. "Brands," Shiro seemed at a loss for words. "I don't know how many times I have to say this, but you don't have to apologize for something this trivial. It's not your duty to make sure nothing ever inconveniences me." But Brands raised his head up, yet was cut off. "But nothing. That goes the same for all of you as well. I never considered you all as subordinates, and you shouldn't consider yourselves subordinates either. We're comrades, aren't we? Why should I feel bothered that I was able to repel someone who could have hurt or killed any of you? Then what about yourself?" Haribel didn't voice her thoughts aloud. The same reasoning could be used against Shiro, but he was clearly making the sacrifice through his own well-being. She could respect that. No, she did respect that. If Shiro wasn't strong and the enemy was stronger, then he'd surely suffer as a result, but for their sake, he'd still do it. In the same way she'd probably sacrifice her well-being to protect Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose, Shiro would definitely do the same for her. "Comrade," Brands echoed the word out, head lowered in shock. Hollows didn't have comrades. They only had enemies seeking to kill them and usurp power, or force them into subservice. "We are your comrades." Shiro seemed confused, the sight of which caused Haribel to snort. Typical that Shiro would break the common conceptions of hollows and not even be aware of it. He could be a tyrant, a ruler with devoted subjects who he offered his protection and swords towards, but he did none of that. Of course. All of you are my comrades. Why would any of you even think otherwise? Shiro tilted his head and blinked, eyebrows raising in confusion. Brands and many other hollows formerly belonging to Shiro's land sucked in a shuddering breath before shouting towards the heavens. You are my king. Now and forever. The shout resounded, and for all of the fanfare and devotion, Haribel's lips twitched upward at Shiro's response. Not this again. Why? Why does this always happen? Of course, Shiro was ignored in the sheer enthusiasm, but Haribel digressed. The discontent and disappointment at herself still lingered within her. She could put aside that she'd come late to be of use to Shiro again, but feeling ignorant to his pains both annoyed her and oddly made her restless. Thinking back on it now, there was a lot that she did not yet know about Shiro, and this included many of the Arrancar in Hueco Mundo. Being as she had met Shiro the earliest apart from Starkey, Lilynet, and Coyote, it felt as if she should know him better. It was a natural assumption, as the more time a person spent with another, it was assumed you got to know them better. This wasn't quite the case though. To Haribel, Shiro had never changed since day one. At first, she'd admired him for his steadfastness, but it all changed when it became evident that there was an aspect of himself that she'd never known. As Shiro managed to convince the other Arrancar and Hollows to disperse, Haribel remained with Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun sticking nearby her. Their devotion was appreciated, but in this instance, she didn't like the way that they could so easily express their thoughts and start bickering with each other at the drop of a dime. In this case, it wasn't bickering that managed to irk Haribel into a displeased mood, but the way the three kept secretly whispering while glancing in Shiro's direction when he wasn't looking. Worse, she could hear them, whereas Shiro could not in respect for privacy. Hey, as if he'd like unruly bitches like you, Sung Sun scoffed, hiding her mouth with a loose sleeve. Refined character and disposition are truly the most desirable in a woman. Says the flat chest, Mila Rose grumbled irritably, prompting Sung Sun's eyes to narrow. Exactly, Apasai hissed out. Woman, what woman? I only see a child with your washboard of a chest. In a rare display of camaraderie, both Apasai and Mila Rose glared down Sung Sun, who was at a loss for words. She could only gnash her teeth in her rage. It wasn't like Mila Rose and Apasai were wrong. Most hollows, creatures of instinct, were blunt, and when asked of their preference for women, big boobs always seemed to come up, something Sung Sun clearly lacked. You both dare. Sung Sun felt her vision turn red. The entire argument began with the premise of who was the most suitable to stand by Shiro's side. Of course, the three considered Haribel as the best choice, but considering how well Haribel could hide her thoughts behind a neutral expression, the three weren't aware that their current topic was ticking her off. May I have a bit of your time, Shiro? Haribel cut off the three's conversation by raising her voice. Alone, she clarified to Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose with a pointed look. The three stopped bickering at her stare and nervously took their leave, unwilling to draw Haribel's ire. Left alone, Haribel finally felt some of her tension leaving her, but all too soon it was replaced by a different feeling of tension. High-strung, nervousness, it made no sense, but she felt as if she was in the midst of battle. Her pupils dilated, taking in everything, as her spiritual energy coursed strongly through her veins. Why was this happening, and why did it seem so difficult to speak all of a sudden? The silence stretched, before she realized that talking had never really been her forte. Keeping calm, she assessed that it would be best to just get to the point. With a cold indifference differing from the disconcertment inside her, she opened her mouth and spoke while crossing her arms. I want to know you better. Blunt was as blunt goes, and Shiro looked as if he'd just been thrown a curveball. She continued. I don't like feeling ignorant, and I want to hear how you know of Coyote, or why Baragan suddenly seems to respect you. I want to be of use to you, to fight alongside you, so I request that you help me with this second release. I've also found myself growing addle-minded for no reason as of late when you're around me, or irritable when I see you talking with another woman. Better yet, Tell me what it means for me to be feeling this way. It's a hindrance, but also pleasant at times. It confuses me. Haribel furrowed her brows at a genuine loss, her ever-composed self giving the image as if she was just talking about something trivial. Then again, for a hollow it just may seem that way. She waited for an answer, but was inwardly vexed that she couldn't solve the problem on her own. Tactics and intelligence were things she'd learned to have in battle, and everything else should have been unnecessary. So, what was this yearning for more? She blinked calmly and watched the way Shiro suddenly began to skirt around the issue. He didn't meet her gaze and seemed to take a particular interest in the sand, before finally addressing her. I don't want to be presumptuous, he offered some sort of excuse, clearly knowing but refusing to explain. I don't understand, was her curt reply. Presumptuous? It's not like that. Then help me understand. For now, let's just move on. She frowned at Shiro, but didn't press the issue. Perhaps he was indirectly telling her to figure it out on her own? This may be the case. Let us move on then, she consented. Shiro released a breath of relief and soon scratched the back of his head. The story between me and Coyote went something like this. Shiro patiently recounted the events of the past and the sacrifice he'd made in creating Hueco Mundo. She was floored. She'd never heard of any greater sacrifice than to give up even one's sense of being. The feeling of yearning deep within her returned all too forcibly. There was an urge within her insisting that she put her claim, but she already failed at the beginning. What claim? What did that even mean she had to do? She frowned, found herself reaching towards Shiro subconsciously, and then just stared at her own actions in confusion. If Shiro noticed anything odd, he didn't speak up. Then, moving on to the second release. The truth is, I'm not too sure myself on how to do it. However, if to release is to return to what you once were, then to release a second time is to go even further back. For example, I can remember everything that had happened to me in my human life now, can you? No, I can't, she shook her head while humming to herself. She then came to a realization. If I end up remembering, will that answer what this unknown feeling I have is? Right now, it's telling me to drag you away, find an isolated place, and fight you till we both give out. Shiro coughed into his hand, nearly choking on his spit. Maybe, he stuttered out. That was all the motivation Haribel needed. She nodded reservedly, a goal now in mind. Then will you help me obtain my second release? Shiro did not refuse. How could he when she was looking so eager? Moreover, helping his comrades grow stronger was something Shiro had always intended on doing. Speaking of which. Why are you hugging me? I do not know. My body moved on its own. I complied. It didn't help that Haribel herself sounded bewildered. Can you let go of me? No. This feels oddly comfortable. She sounded entirely calm, as if noting facts. Why is that? The road to a second release was going to be long and far. Worse, unknown to anyone, the situation at large was rapidly beginning to change. Jin Ishimaru's decision would make sure of that. Chapter 54, Hero or Villain, Part 3. Jin Interlude. All plans must come to an end, and if anyone understood this point better than anyone in Hueco Mundo, it was undoubtedly Jin Ichimaru. From the eyes of a genius, the world was just one large set of rules with set boundaries and constraints able to be identified through logic. The same could be said about the human psyche. If one knew the limits of a person's tolerance, their likes, desires, and motivations, then it would be a simple matter to guide said person's point of view in a form of manipulation. Eisen had surpassed even this. Eisen did not simply analyze and comprehend the nature of any individual, he altered them based on necessity. The subject being misled in the first place would not once suspect foul play, as they themselves would believe that what they were doing was of their own volition. Momo Hinamori, Eisen's former lieutenant of Squad 5, was one such example. Even until the end she never doubted Eisen, and Jin suspected that given a few choice words, Eisen could convince her that he'd been wrongfully accused. Eisen's cunning was not to be underestimated, and Jin himself knew this for a fact. It takes one genius to get into the skin of another. It was a battle of wits and shrewdness, and Jin was more than willing to play and win. That is, until now. With the same eyes and voice that once said we'd be inseparable, could you still say the same now? Jin Ichimaru frowned ever so slightly, the perpetual smile over his features fading. Jin. Where are you going again? To be a Shinigami. Why? I've made up my mind. I'm going to become a Soul Reaper. I'm going to become a Soul Reaper to change things. I'll fix everything, so you won't be crying anymore. A small smile, and a vague response filled only with half-truths, never revealing anything substantial. Old memories and promises caused Jin no small amount of hesitation, and this was dangerous. He couldn't allow for any breaks in his persona, or it was game over. He wasn't being prideful, but he placed himself on a similar level to Aizen in his ability to read people. A single slip-up would be instantly noticed. He couldn't allow that to happen, and yet, as one who put himself on the same intellectual level as Aizen, he knew that he was already running away from the truth. Rangiku, the only one who ever really mattered to him, would never condone his actions. He could tell that all that she'd ever wanted was for him to be by her side like old times. Instead, here he was convincing himself that he was fighting for her sake while ultimately understanding that he was only making excuses. He wanted revenge. He was petty like that. Aizen had harmed Rangiku and took something from her. Most likely a part of her spiritual energy. Whether or not she'd ever make captain with the reserves she had left was enough to infuriate him all over again. If Tuan spoke of justice, then this was Jin's justice. Making sure that there was no one around, Jin entered a private tunnel he'd made for himself in Hueco Mundo that led directly into the Minos forest. Once inside, he flash-stepped deep into the core of the forest where he grinned slyly. He did not know how many days had passed since the Quincy had first made their appearance in Hueco Mundo, but Aizen had not been idle. He was occupied with prying information out of the Quincy, who introduced a sudden new variable into his plan, meaning that Jin now had the leisure to act on his own. It was the first time such an opportunity had landed in his lap in years, and he knew better than to waste it. He could not predict the outcome of what was to transpire with the introduction of the Quincy, but he was certain that he had to adjust his goal of murdering Aizen once again. Waiting for an opportunity for Aizen to let his guard down was never going to happen anymore, not with the Vasto of White around, who could prove to be an even bigger monster than Aizen. Things would change if he could get the Vasto of White on his side like Shinso had suggested, but it was unlikely at the moment. There weren't even any chances to make contact between evading Aizen's suspicion, and the other Arrancar flocking to their lord. So no, things weren't exactly going to any sort of plan or consensus. This being the case, Jin could no longer remain idle. If an opportunity to kill Aizen would never come, then what point was there in maintaining the charade any longer? There was none, but that didn't mean that a chance did not exist. With a meticulous hand, he activated one of Aizen's inventions. Hollows could open Garganta at will, but Shinigami could not do so, making it difficult to enter Hueco Mundo. Aizen bypassed this natural barrier by creating a device that mimicked the action of opening a Garganta. A black and distorted corridor formed in front of Jin. He was going to take a risk, but he was confident enough of leaving and returning before his absence was noticed, if at all. See, the Minos forest had this distinct property of making it difficult to locate anyone inside. It had something to do with the vast amount of Minos and the constant fighting causing the spiritual energy to be difficult to distinguish. One would have to know what they were looking for or risk not finding anything at all. Jin was not that naive. Aizen was a monster who could sense spiritual energy with pinpoint accuracy. Extending his hand forward, he produced a ball of his own spiritual energy and hurled it through the Minos forest. The Minos and hollows that were attracted to the potent energy attempted to eat it, but only got their heads blasted in the process. The ball continued to sail. With the amount of power that he'd created it with, it should be enough to last for a good hour or two. With his energy lingering in the Minos forest, Aizen would have the impression that he was still around. Well then, Jin quickly masked his spiritual energy and stepped into the corridor before him. Let's see if this works out. Did you not know, Aizen? Never trust the mouth of a cornered snake. It carries poison. When next he knew it, he was back in the Rukon district of the Soul Society, but this was far from what he was expecting. His narrowed eyes uncharacteristically widened, the scent of ash and soot wafting up into his nose. The Siriti was burning, smoke rising up into the sky in wisps from the direction of the Sekizeki stone walls dropped down from the heavens in times of emergency. Flashes of light and buffeting winds spread outwards rapidly, forcing him to shield his gaze with an arm. The intensity of the spiritual energies in the air was not lost on him, but for all the damage being done, he could care less. He'd never viewed being a Shinigami as a position of justice to defeat all evil. To be truthful, he'd never even wanted to be one until the day he returned home to find Rangiku hurt by Shinigami under Aizen's command. The position was nothing more than a means to an end. Values? Sentiments? Perhaps he may have had a few such as his former lieutenant who never doubted him, but so what? If the Shinigami's forces were already so far beaten that their overall strength dwindled, what was the point in coming back to the Siriti in the first place to recruit manpower? Looks like his initial plans have gone to shit again. He had no intention of doing something as foolish as meeting the head commander or any former squad captain in order to explain his position acting as a double agent for Aizen. No one would believe him, and even then, they'd be suspicious. He was on a time limit before Aizen would notice his absence. There was no way he could stay for any longer, so he'd simply planned to leave behind clues for the smarter captains to pick up on. If an opportunity to strike Aizen would never come by waiting, then there was another means available. Give me a chance. That's all I'll need. Jin hummed lightly to himself. If the captains understood what he wanted, then the possibility of success would increase drastically. However, it would seem that he could no longer rely on the Siriti. He frowned while looking at all the destruction around him. The people of the Rokkenji were running. As spirits with pitifully low spiritual energy, the spiritual pressure emanating from whatever battle was occurring in the distance was crushing. Men and women alike clawed at one another for the chance of running farther away. Vending shops were destroyed, buildings toppled from mounting pressure. Screams echoed through the air, mixed in with the scent of blood, and a palpable fear. Jin had never seen it this bad, ever. It was as if the Siriti would fall, but wasn't that impossible? Head Captain Yamamoto was still alive, and even Aizen had to develop a means to deal with Ryujinjaka's flames. It wasn't a lie to say that Yamamoto was the backbone of the court guard squads. So long as he stood tall, the Siriti would never crumble. Therefore, Jin wasn't worried. The old man was tenacious, and despite the damage, recovery would surely take place. Caught up in his musings, he allowed a local woman from the Rokkenji to grab him by the sleeve of his hakama and shake him with trembling hands. "You're a Shinigami, aren't you? Why aren't you helping?" The woman was crying, desperate. Unable to respond at first, all he managed to do was put up his signature fox-like grin. The woman balked, backing away in fear as he disregarded her like many did when he smiled. Only Rangiku had never been uncomfortable with it. Should he help? There was no benefit, and it wasn't as if Yamamoto would lose. Instead, it was probably better to return back to Hueco Mundo while he can. He'd wanted to be subtle in his visit, so it wouldn't do if he was spotted. Well, then, the Siriti could fend for itself. Turning around, he readied another device to return back the way he came from, yet froze mid-action. His analytical mind ground to a halt, as for the second time in his life, he lost himself to rage. His eyes widened while staring up at a familiar figure sailing down from the walls of the Siriti after a resounding bang ejected pieces of rubble and debris everywhere. It was her. No matter how she changed growing up, Jin only ever saw the girl he first met in his youth, tied together by their shared love of persimmons. Rangiku. The name slipped out of his mouth long after his body had already taken action. He moved faster than he'd ever done before. Gone was any trace of amusement and replaced instead by smoldering fury. Part of the reason Jin still followed Aizen was that Aizen had promised to leave Rangiku for him to deal with. As he would never hurt Rangiku, this all but guaranteed her safety from Aizen, who, despite being deceptive, never went back on his own words. Lining his position to Rangiku's trajectory, he caught her with a firm grip, smile leaving his face as traces of blood smeared across his cheek. His teeth gnashed together so hard that he heard a crack echo in his ears. What was the point of his revenge? Hadn't it always been for her sake? So that she'd never cry again? So why? Why was it like this? He glared up from where Rangiku had been blown away from and spied the figure of white-clothed individuals atop the Siridi's walls. The uniform was one he'd seen recently in Aizen's labs. Quincy. That was it. That was the last straw. He'd thought that they were just an unknown variable that would be useful in delaying Aizen's plans, but when variable turned into enemy, the distinction was damning in his mind. Gin, Rangiku suddenly rasped out, her eyes widening despite the exhaustion she was feeling. What are ya doing here getting blown off a wall? Are you alright? His mouth asked one thing, but his mind asked another. Rangiku didn't respond. Jin didn't know it, but she'd been staring up at his face ever since he'd caught her, and what she'd seen was the same concern he'd always shown for her in their childhood. Unknown to Jin, the last apology he'd ever given to her just before leaving with Aizen had never once left her mind. Rangiku was told that Jin was now her enemy, but a deeper part of her could never accept it. To see him rescuing her, and being angered on her behalf, she could no longer hold back the tears. It was a familiar embrace, one where she'd always drawn comfort from. More than anything, tragedy had occurred in the Siridi, and despite being a grown woman, the bitterness was too difficult to bear without release. Rangiku didn't have the energy to speak. She was in no condition to, but the tears were the only things Jin was focusing on, and it did things to him on a mental level. He'd made a promise. One that he'd given away his life on. Smoke billowed in the distance. Jin knew the Siridi to be under siege. He asked himself again why he should care. But this time the answer was different. Veins popped over his skin, his narrowed eyes opening to reveal the sharp azure pupils beneath. He'd been naive. Since when was Aizen the only one who could cause Rangiku to cry? White spiritual energy erupted around him like a torch, one hand cradling Rangiku while another rested on his Zanpakuto's hilt. Shoot to kill. A new target of vengeance existed before him. Shinso. Chapter 55, Hero or Villain, Part 4. One overall look at the Siridi was all that it took for Shinso to conclude that there was no saving it. No Shinigami was at his or her best since the battle of the fake Karakura town, and Yamamoto was no exception. Strategically, it was an opportune moment that only a fool would pass up on. Battles were raging from everywhere within the Siridi, plumes of smoke, piles of rubble, and puddles of blood able to be seen for as far as the eye can see. The situation was beyond grim, it was terrible. Jin, what are you doing right now? Shinso felt as Jin's emotions caused rain to fall within his inner world, a violent storm of anger and guilt derived from his failure to keep a single promise. Tears were stained over Rangiku's face and she'd fallen unconscious from blood loss. But this wasn't the point. You weren't supposed to cry again. Everything was done for the sake of that single reason, and yet here and now, the woman Jin treasured above all was thrown so deep into despair that the sight of Jin caused her to weep. Shinso felt the storm in Jin's inner world shift into a typhoon. The small smile on Jin's face was dangerously misleading. Jin was mad, no, he was furious to the point where he'd been forced to bottle it all down lest he become impulsive in battle. From Jin's view, all Shino could see were the nearest Quincy Jin was planning to vent on. In the next second, Jin called upon Shinso's ability, and regardless of the distance, sent a strike right through the hearts of the enemy. However, it wasn't enough. It wasn't even close to calming down his rage, and in a single stride, Jin hopped over the Siridi's walls and scanned for more quarry. Meanwhile, Shinso had a panoramic view of the entire situation surrounding the Siridi as a Zanpakuto spirit. He was unseen to all, and had the means to move at his leisure. If he closed his eyes and listened, he could even hear the individual orders, shouts, and screams issued by the Shinigami. They've passed the interior walls. Division buildings 6 and 7 are being overrun. Help. We need to get the injured to the 4th Division barracks before they die. No matter what, don't use your Bankai against the enemy. They can somehow steal it. It was here that Shinso gave pause to the voices filtering into his mind through his spiritual senses. Don't use Bankai? He couldn't understand why such an order was being given when he could tell that the Quincy invading the Siridi were too strong not use their Bankai against. However, it was because Shinso was a Zanpakuto spirit that he could immediately understand what the Shinigami meant by stealing Bankai. He could see them clear as day, his fellow Zanpakuto spirits trapped in a pentagon-shaped badge and violently attempting to escape to no avail. They were just like how he'd seen them within the mindscape of a world of unlimited blades. Elegant and collected higher in Meru, the gigantic ice-blue serpentine dragon. Reserved and dutiful Senbon Zakura of the Thousand Rose Petals. Armored Samaria, Tenkan. Lethal Suzumibuki. They were all being forced to watch as their partnered Shinigami were beaten right in front of them with their Zanpakuto's own powers. It was wrong, so utterly wrong that Shinso grew wary. Of all the captains presently fighting in the Seirai, Jin was the only captain-level Shinigami fighting at full capacity, and his presence was like a torch, quickly drawing notice by both Quincy and Shinigami alike. Yamamoto, who was fighting at the center alongside members of the Zero Squad, narrowed his eyes at Jin, but was too preoccupied with the leader of the Quincy before him to intervene. This didn't stop the rest of the Shinigami from voicing their thoughts aloud. 3rd Division Captain Jin Ichimaru? That's him, isn't it? The traitor? What's he doing here? No way, is Aizen planning another attack now of all times? And no wait. He's attacking the Quincy. Jin could care less about what others were saying. To him, all that really mattered was exacting vengeance. For the simple sin of hurting Rangiku, he'd bided his time drawing closer to Aizen for the sole purpose of killing him. Against those who'd made Rangiku cry a second time, he didn't have an ounce of mercy. Shinso knew Jin to be vindictive, but this was taking it to another level. Could he not see what was before his eyes or assess the situation in its entirety? The spiritual pressure of 4 captains had already been reduced to barely nothing, 2 of which included Byakuya Kukaki and Zaraki Kenpeki, who were both on the verge of death. The Quincy were proving far more formidable than they'd been in Hueco Mundo. It was likely that this was the main force of the Quincy sent to attack the Seirai. Presently, no Quincy of a rank known as the Stern Ritter or Star Knight moved to intercept Jin. They were too preoccupied with the members of the Zero Squad and Yamamoto, who were suddenly put into a dire situation. Shinso listened to the words he could pick up in the air. You have done well to last this long, Roydloid. This particular voice sent shivers down Shinso's spine. Even in a spiritual form, Shinso felt the gravity of the man's aura and realized with startling clarity that the Seirai was doomed. This power, the sheer magnitude, was enormous. Worse yet, the sight of Ryujinjaka suddenly trapped in one of those pentagon-shaped badges had Shinso reeling. He listened further. Whack, Yamamoto's tone was grave. You've aged, Yamamoto, and to think even the members of the Zero Squad have decided to intervene early. How fittingly convenient. What do you mean by that? You shouldn't even be alive, said a voice Shinso could not recognize, but it was clearly a member of the Zero Squad. A grunt sounding more like a scoff came in reply. Shall I spell it out for you? You, the guardians of the royal palace, have left your stations. Now what do you all think that means if I destroy that cannon over there? Suddenly, it was deathly silent. No, you can't. Stop him at all costs. Despite not being able to infer the depth and meaning of what was just said, all things considered, Shinso came to a single conclusion. Jin, you are acting too recklessly. Shinso said urgently. Do not lose sight of what really matters. We must leave now. The Seirai is done for. Shinso, Jin inwardly replied back before glancing down to Rangiku, whom he still held in his left arm. He trusted no one else but himself to ensure her safety. With that in mind, there was no way he could fight properly right now anyway. Fine. Jin carefully adjusted his hold on Rangiku and began planning out a method of escape. Running back to Hueco Mundo was something he couldn't do. There was no way to explain himself to Aizen, and more than that, he didn't like the way Shinso kept insisting that he could trust the Vasto of White. Then what was he to do? The answer was simple to him. The human world. Jin grasped tightly onto the hilt of his sword and swatted away arrows of Reishi fired at him from the Quincy's bows. It was starting to become annoying. Wind whipped across his face as he began to backpedal into retreat. From a certain perspective, it may seem as if Jin had just impulsively attacked the Quincy in a fit of anger, but in truth, he was observing. He'd always been bright and intelligent, and he knew that if he wanted vengeance, then going in blind was stupid. For the time being, he was satisfied with his reconnaissance. The leader of the Quincy was a man named Waiwak, and the Quincy also had the power to obtain bankais. These two facts would be crucial in the future. Moreover, if a Shinigami could not deploy their bankai against the Quincy, did that mean that the Siridi would have to rely on hollows? Questions for later. For now, Jin planned on dropping off Rangiku somewhere safe in the human world before returning to Hueco Mundo and offering the intelligence he'd gleaned for Aizen to use. The man was cunning and evil, but he was anything if not capable. If the Quincy meddled with Aizen's plans, then Aizen would surely retaliate, and hopefully both sides would wear each other out. Now all that was left was to focus on escape. Shinso nodded at Jin's quick decision and shift in priority, but faltered when both he and Jin saw Rangiku begin to purse her eyes. Jin. Rangiku rasped out, her vision bleary as she roused in and out of consciousness. Jin grunted, his hold over Rangiku tightening ever so slightly as he tensed. He'd done a lot of things behind Rangiku's back, and now that she was in a position to question him, he felt stifled with guilt. Not now, Ran, just rest. Jin insisted with that fox-like grin on his face. I'll get you out of this mess just like old times' sake. Rangiku took a moment to process Jin's words, and when she did, her lips began to quiver. She was so exhausted that she could barely keep her eyes open, but she forced out the single word she'd not been able to ask. Why? It was strange how just one word could be filled with such emotion, such desperation, but like Jin had said before, this wasn't the time. I promise I'll tell you later, but for now, let me get you out of here. It was enough of a reply to appease Rangiku, but other than Jin's circumstances, she still had much to concern herself over and frantically held onto the hem of Jin's Shiakusho with a white-knuckled grip. See Captain Hichugaya, the Siridi. She choked out. They need help. To Rangiku's horror, Jin shook his head. I'm getting you out of here, Rangiku, and that's final. Everything else can be dealt with later. And what makes you think you're getting away, Shinigami? Jin's eyes suddenly widened while any words of protest Rangiku was on the verge of yelling died in her mouth. All that was left was shock, alarm, and panic, which Jin realized was oddly being directed at him. What just happened? Jin lost his footing and tumbled over the ground, his shoulder scraping hard against the pavement. Heiligpfeil, holy arrow, a voice echoed in the wind as a bullet-sized hole was drilled deep into the ground. Shinso and Rangiku stared as a bleeding hole appeared over Jin's upper left pectoral area, a shower of blood and gore staining Jin's clothes. Jin himself couldn't understand what had happened. He was in a war zone, he'd not dropped his guard once and was certain that there were no lethal enemies nearby. He'd sensed nothing that should have been able to harm him. Shinso saw differently. Far out from where Jin had been attacked, a man with dark skin, short white hair, and a cross-shaped mark over his left eye readied another shot. Jin! Rangiku yelled hoarsely, but Jin wasn't paying attention. Where? Who was it? Jin's eyes kept scanning for his adversary in order to defend himself, but could not find anyone before the sound of another shot echoed. Even if Jin wanted to dodge, his intuition warned him that the target this time was Rangiku, and he'd rather he take the shot than her. Shinso reeled at the realization. No. Shinso could not stand here and just do nothing, but as a Zankuto spirit, he could not interact with anything. Wait? Wasn't there still a way? A Zanpakuto is a sword made from a part of a Shinigami's soul unique to their person, bearing differing personalities. This was to say, they were sentient weapons, and sentient weapons were also found in the soul of a certain individual. O merciful king, grant me strength. Shiro felt a pull before anything else. Regardless of what he was presently doing, he focused in on the sensation welling up from deep within him and came to a startling discovery. A sword erected with its tip buried deep in the ground was violently shaking. A weapon was calling out to him from within his reality marble. It wasn't just any weapon either, it was a Zankuto. To say he was startled was an understatement. This was the first time something of this nature had ever happened to him, and he was momentarily at a loss. His reality marble had acquired a variety of Zanpakuto from the moment he laid eyes on the swords of the Shinigami. The spirits that inhabit the blades generally remained docile and spent their time marveling at the sight of a hill of swords, but not this time. Shinso, the Zankuto of Jin Ichimaru, was desperately calling for assistance. In Hueco Mundo, Zanpakuto spirits had the ability to freely manifest, such as how Kyuka Suijutsu had done prior, but anywhere else was another story. They didn't have the ability to take material form, but there was a loophole. Tracing, his unique mage craft, was the process of projecting said swords out into reality. Each Zanpakuto, spirits, and all, were the same as any other weapon in his reality marble. They were stored in his inner world. Ergo, he could theoretically trace them into existence, which was exactly what Shinso was asking of him. There was no reason to accept, however. In the end, Shiro ended up agreeing. More than anything, he agreed because he could feel the sort of motivation Shinso was fighting for. Shinso was fighting with the will to save. For this reason alone, he would lend his strength. I am the bone of my sword. Jin and Rangiku froze in disbelief as the clang of metal slicing apart a bullet-like arrow of Reishi resounded. Motes of golden light were dancing in the wind, converging upon a single point and quickly taking form. Shinso stood in his full glory, sword drawn and body wreathed in ethereal cloth, poised to strike. He was a slender man with an unnerving grin on his face, long silver hair dangling haphazardly down his shoulders. In a way, he was much like Jin. He could care less about others, but when it concerned people he cherished, even a snake will bare its fangs. You will not touch them. No sooner than Shinso spoke, a hailstorm of arrows descended, each unerringly deflected with a skill equal to that of Jin. The only difference between them was that Shinso knew where the enemy was located. Sparks glowed in the aftermath, mixing with the dust and grime and illuminating Shinso's face. Between Jin and Rangiku, Jin was the most startled with the developments. Go, Shinso said only a single word, and how could Jin not understand Shinso's sentiments? Thank you, Jin said in earnest. Wincing from his wound, Jin carried Rangiku away in search of a hell butterfly to lead the way to the human world. Instantly, more arrows were shot in Jin's direction, but once again Shinso moved, obstructing the attacks with his sword. Your opponent is me? Jin, who was fleeing the scene, could not understand why Shinso sounded so confident. Apart from his injury, he and Shinso were roughly equal in strength. Sensing the sheer number of able adversaries presently in the Siriti, even Jin could not say he'd be able to survive if he stayed. Jin wasn't wrong. Shinso knew this point clearly, which was why he squared his shoulders, spread his feet shoulder-width apart, and stood his ground. To the king he gives his gratitude. Suddenly, Shinso's very form down to his blade shattered into pieces held together by surging spiritual energy. For a noble phantasm, there was a concept known as a broken phantasm. If a noble phantasm is packed with more magical energy than it can contain, it breaks and releases a level of power beyond its normal capabilities. One could say it is the fallout of shattering a crystallized myth and destroying the illusion of its grandeur for a fleeting spike in power that can only be used once. But this spike in power was not to be underestimated, for it represented the full might of a legend. This was true for all noble phantasms, and in this case, Zanpakuto, which became broken phantasms in a different manner. The thing was, Shiro's tracing bypassed the single-use principle. Shinso's current form, for example, was nothing more than a copy of his true self. A disposable vessel that could be remade, meaning that there were no repercussions in overloading it. By breaking the body and letting go of all their power, Zanpakuto reached their final stage beyond even Bankai, known as the final. In this case, the final Shinso could be released without the demerit of Jin forever losing his Shinigami power. A new level of strength will momentarily be reached. It's often said that one can't sense the strength of those far above their limitations, similar to how a two-dimensional being could not hope to comprehend a three-dimensional existence. What does this mean for Zanpakuto spirits, which can't ordinarily be sensed by Shinigami, Hollow, Quincy, or even humans? They existed in separate realms. Shinso did not fear death. All he cared about was being strong enough to protect those that mattered to him. If Jin was sad, he was sad. If Jin was angry, he was angry. Finally, Shinso's bubbling wrath reached the surface. He let it all go and burned away at the vessel of his body. Right here. Right now. All Quincy were the enemy. God, human, hollow, monster, none targeted by this blade will survive unscathed. I will be the spear that topples gods and shakes the world asunder. Bankai. A torrent of spiritual energy erupted around him, condensing into a massive sphere of energy that took on the shape of a raging inferno. Kamishinai no Yuri. Check the description for the links to the author.